It's a delight to be here. And as Beatrice has mentioned, it's particularly wonderful to have been able to inhabit this building for 3 days. I want to add my thanks, my gratitude to Anat in particular for making this encounter possible, and also to the faculty of FAU for all their hard work, and a special note to the students who have been so busy making our lives easier as we present. Why don't I just get started, because I'm also grateful to all of you as an audience for having the patience to sit through 3 days of roundtables and lectures, and now you're still here. So thank you for that. Okay. Even in these days of ordering books online, it's still exciting to enter a bookstore. You never know what you're going to discover. Yet, I must confess to a certain melancholy when I peruse the section on architecture. There, aligned alphabetically, you find architects' names on the spines of the books, many of them reflecting deep new research into the oeuvre of an architect or the development of a style. But where are the books on architecture whose titles don't match the categories bookstores use to shelve and sell books? What about the other topics of architectural history, such as how we live in buildings, how buildings shape identities, how architectural design enables daily life? The topics that reveal the way architecture and design operate in our lives now and in the past. For instance, why aren't those in the history section of the bookstore? Today, I'd like to discuss how architectural historians represent the history of architecture, what generates our questions, what values they represent. And specifically, I want to examine architectural history that crosses disciplinary boundaries, and most importantly, that communicates the importance of the built environment as an agent of social and cultural processes. In other words, the books that don't easily fit into the bookstore's categories. Now, this is a pragmatic historiography I'm going to present. I mean, my goal is not to contribute to the development of theory, but to engage the historiographical issues that help us become more aware of the task we undertake when we write history. That is, how we want to use architectural evidence and architectural forms of knowledge to understand the past. I feel a certain urgency because so few in the public, or so few in other historical and spatial disciplines, are listening and learning from us. After hearing so many fine and probing presentations over the past 3 days, I'm sorry to raise a pessimistic note at our conclusion, but I must ask, whom are we addressing? Where does architectural history fit into the broader spectrum of history, and who cares about it? I believe that much of architectural history is on the margins of historical inquiry because we have not made it adequately clear how much we have to contribute to those outside the architecture discipline, and how much work architecture does in society, the nature of its performance and agency. So let's return to our sheep, those books that don't fit into any categories in the bookstore. They are orphaned in comparison with monographs about specific architects, styles, or national traditions that represent research wishing to answer the developmental question, how a building ended up taking its final form. This need not, of course, mean purely formal analysis or stylistic development. It may involve the study of patrons, pedagogy, technology, journalism, myriad of factors that impinge on a design solution. But the point is that the explanation is aiming at clarifying why a building or set of buildings takes a particular shape or configuration. We might compare that kind of history with romance narratives. Those end with the happy resolution of the couple marrying and then living happily ever after. We follow with intense curiosity the twists and turns along the way to that final resolution and feel quite satisfied when the couple strolls off into the sunset. Such romantic narratives never question the day after the honeymoon. They don't inquire into the way the marriage turns out, its tensions and unfolding daily life. Similarly, one standard model for narratives in architectural history is to study minutely the genesis of an architect's solution. And to do that well can require great ingenuity, patient and assiduous analysis of the drawings in the archive, and clever interpolations. Another standard narrative model is the architect's biography, the story of a life from start through development, achievement, and demise. And all of these have in common the linear narrative structure of origin, development, end. However, it has long become evident to many of us that we need other forms of narrative to convey the agency of the built environment. And the obvious one is the post-marital story. In other words, what is the life of the building once it has been constructed? Some years ago, Neil Harris wrote a stimulating book about exactly that topic. We might call this the biography of a building, how it gains meaning in the lives of those who use it, or in the life of the city, suburb, or other context in which it functions. This is just one example of the kind of question that can lead to other forms of storytelling that embody architectural experience and architectural knowledge. The story of a building's use and meaning after construction, its reception history, transformation over time, will involve issues of space, function, technology, and other issues directly related to what it is to know architecture, and that may require narrative structures conveying multi-directional exchanges and networks not subsumed by a linear storyline. But the romantic narrative is the plot that seems natural. That's because we can follow a straight storyline from conception to completion. There appears to be a natural sequence that unfolds in a line that can be easily followed and makes sense. Those kinds of stories are also attractive because they configure heroes and models, both the designer and the building itself, for instance. And for both architects and students aspiring to become architects, such stories are quite flattering. It's no surprise that architectural history has tended to privilege narratives so constructed. They emerge directly out of professional and pedagogical practice, where the study of past and current architecture as model and foil has been a useful means of conveying architectural ideas, even though we all know that architecture is a collaborative process, inadequately reflected by art history's Vasarian method of studying creative geniuses or paradigmatic buildings. However, it is possible to imagine quite different narrative structures for recounting the history of architecture than the linearity of development. Saul Steinberg anticipated that I was going to say that, so he provided this nice diagram for you. Naturally, there is architecture without architects, the turn of attention to architecture that grows outside established institutions and becomes a lingua franca, understood, naturalized, and taken for granted, though this too can be turned into a charged romantic history of a different tint than heroic biography. The mythology of primitive innocence, the tale of vanished golden age, or focus on originary tropes. And that narrative structure is, in turn, the counterpoint to stories that are developmental with a view of the movement to the future. For instance, the dream of perfectible society through architecture. That one's familiar. These narrative structures are, I would suggest, variations on what François Hartog calls regimes of historicity. How we construct our sense of time. The assumed relationship between past, present, and future. The forms of time perception. Historiography today invites us to consider consciously how we are perceiving and construing time, and this in turn affects how we construct historical narratives. Reinhard Koselleck, Artaud, and Peter Fritsche, among others, all argue in different ways that the French Revolution and Napoleonic era marked a shift in the ways of existing within and experiencing time in the West. A new form of historical consciousness arose, moving from a focus on the past as model to a developmental or evolutionary model of time, implying a teleological future. That developmental perception of time has dominated historical practices in the West, even after their critique and dissection in recent years. For some 40 years or so, there have been architectural historians who have been looking for narrative strategies that avoid the Whig assumption of improvement, progress, development, evolution. Those products of the 19th century invention of historicism have repeatedly been called into question. The life of the building, already mentioned, in which the building is no longer seen as finished when constructed, but is viewed as being dynamically produced through its usage, may end up narrating an episodic story with no specific directionality, but one that reveals the way that buildings work. Stories of other modernisms have enriched and complicated our sense of any correct line of historical development. Some architectural historians have absorbed lessons from such varied thinkers as Henri Lefebvre or Raymond Williams, and others of that generation, seeking to wrest free of the normalizing vision of the establishment in order to liberate our understanding of the lived lives of the individual and group. The results have been histories whose temporal shapes diverge from straight linearity, that spiral, branch, flow, or eschew the line altogether to create an image of time, as these varied diagrams of time suggest. Now, these kinds of narrative tend not to place the architect at their center. Indeed, the architect may nearly disappear altogether from the story. Instead, the focus may be on social processes such as domesticity, governmentality, nation building, representation, identity, or racism. Compared with a focus on an architect's development, this kind of story may be distinctly unglamorous, but it allows exploration of questions that can demonstrate the operations of architecture in society and culture that may not appear in a history that privileges individual achievement or the genesis of form. Our dissatisfaction with the grand narrative of modernism's rise reflects a general swerve from grand narrative in history writ large. Some would date this disenchantment with the 19th century regime of historicity to 1968, others to 1989, but in any case, with increasing alienation from the West's means to achieving Enlightenment goals, with the development of post-colonial perspectives, with the fall of the wall, globalization, the arc of historical projection that began after the French Revolution has lost its explanatory power. History as an explanation of origins, where we came from, and of path, where we're heading, made some sense when its authors believed in a goal. But with the critique of ideas dominant in Western historiography, such as Eurocentric advance, modernization, the civilizing mission, the very notion of history as explanatory has declined, replaced with history as description, interpretation, and representation, demonstrating simultaneous views and imbrications, tasked with revealing meanings rather than causality. One way to avoid overarching teleological narrative arcs has been the turn to microhistory, deep synchronic studies of past episodes that attempt thick description, or to use anthropologist Clifford Geertz's words, quote, believing with Max Weber that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun, I take culture to be those webs, and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning, unquote. Now, I wish I had time to unpack that potent sentence more fully, but right now, I'd just simply like to draw your attention to the metaphor webs, and note that if culture is a web, then the historical explanations and interpretations it requires cannot generate simple narrative lines. The turn to microhistory, with its careful but narrowed focus on particular webs of meaning, has proven very fruitful, always with the potential that is viewing into the corner of a larger picture. But most recently, there has been a call by historians to find new ways to gain a much larger perspective, yet do so without falling into the trap of the old regime of historicity. I mention here briefly the deep history of Daniel Lord Smale, who studies medieval African and Mediterranean history, quote, under the assumption that history is not a political science designed to explain the present. It is an anthropological science designed to help us understand humanity, unquote. Or Barry Cunliffe, whose neo-Brodelian approach to early European history takes the ocean as its organizing unit and analyzes geographical conditions and networks of flows, long-term perspectives that adapt methods of the Annales school and shift the early medieval history of Europe from stories of proto-nations to a more nuanced sense of Europe's long-term connections and exchanges. Or Jack Goody, who manages to resituate the Italian Renaissance. We thought we knew where it was. Resituate the Italian Renaissance by demonstrating the recurring nature of such cultural patterns of renewal at many times and in many cultures. Or Bailey, whose Birth of the Modern World, to some extent like Chakraborty's, I'm really falling over these words now, to some extent like Chakraborty's Provincializing Europe, shows the rise of global uniformities in a multi-centered world during the 19th century, invoking not only the evidence of political and economic life, but bodily practices such as dress and the consumption of food. Architecture should be in there, but he doesn't discuss it. With industrialization and urbanization becoming global phenomena, his history tells of local specificities as well as of interdependence and exchange. Finally, I mentioned Dror Varman's Making of the Modern Self, a magisterial consideration of the historicity of how a person is construed, paying particular attention to the emergence of individuality. Each of these ambitious historical schemes suggests a myriad of directions in which architectural history itself might go. Each has implications for how we view buildings and how people interact with the built environment. And each opens opportunities to demonstrate how architecture performs as a constitutive historical agent, if only by bringing the skills of architectural knowledge, that is, the intrinsic knowledge of architectural thinking, to bear on new questions revealed by emerging historical approaches. A few social and cultural historians have already learned enough from architectural historians to apply those skills to answering questions generated from their inquiries into social and cultural practices. McKeon's influential study on the construction of public and private life in early modern Europe uses close analysis of domestic floor plans to demonstrate the way the separation of private from public was spatialized between the 15th and 18th centuries, helping to constitute a new social hierarchy of consumers and producers. Maiken Umbach, writing as a historian of the German bourgeoisie around 1900, studies public and domestic architecture in Hamburg to explore the way liberal governmentality gave rise to the expressing of a strong sense of the uniqueness of place, one that opened up a wealth of new and increasingly modern ways of investing the cityscape with a sense of the past, in contrast with historicism. Given her deep engagement with the social history of her subjects, she's been able to discern distinctions between architectural approaches that had escaped previous notice by architectural historians. Professors of literature Victoria Rosner and Julia Prewitt-Brown have both studied the representation of domestic interiors in fiction in order to understand the construction of gender and self. Brown, in particular, influenced by the writings of architectural historians Alice Friedman and Anthony Vidler, has produced a fascinating book. Another literature professor, Betsy Klinemeth, has used literature as a source for understanding the American home around 1900, applying the typologies of row house, tenement, apartment building, and luxury hotel. So we can see that here is a small but growing group of people in fields outside our own who are listening to us and making use of what we do. This needs to occur more often. So, the exchange between disciplines is a two-way street. Let me mention just a few examples of recent work, somewhat arbitrarily selected from my own bookshelves, as all of these examples have been. I just turned around and I pulled things off the shelf that I thought might be useful for us. So these are books by architectural historians whose questions arise from issues in social and cultural history and whose work makes significant contributions both to architectural history and other fields. Diane Harris has just published a book on post-war American suburban houses that, quote, examines the cultural work performed by houses and domestic artifacts intended for a middle-class audience and by textual and visual representations of those houses that entered mainstream culture in the United States, unquote. She examines the roles of the visual and material fields in constituting and reinforcing ideas about race, ethnicity, and class in American post-war culture as they related to ideas about home ownership. She calls her analysis of the way the built environment shapes public opinion, perception, and belief spatial rhetoric. Timothy Hyde, who may be in the audience somewhere, he's been here, one of our speakers, has just published the book Constitutional Modernism, Architecture and Civil Society in Cuba, in which he shows how, quote, architects placed architecture centrally within the compass of an emerging construction of civil society, unquote. By approaching his topic through constitutionalism, Tim writes, he is able to open, quote, a complex confluence of disciplinary practices, social conventions, and finally, political possibilities and impossibilities, unquote. Despina Strategakos' book on fin de siècle Berlin demonstrated, quote, how women remapped Berlin as the birthplace of a female subject, unquote. She examines buildings that had nothing to do with the emergence of modern architecture per se, but rather with the emergence of a modern urban bourgeois woman, engaged in creating new buildings in Berlin at the same time that the buildings opened possibilities for new spatial practices and through them new ways of living. My point here has been a simple one about how we pursue time, or perhaps how time chases us. While there is still much to learn about architectural history from methodologies honed in art history or in the architectural studio, there's a wealth yet to be learned from the interaction with other disciplines like social history, geography, anthropology, gender studies, the list goes on. Essential to the public understanding of architecture is to demonstrate what architecture does, where it is an active agent, how it operates, how it becomes invested with meaning, and what social systems it participates in or shapes. As social and cultural historians abandon the assumption that only texts are reliable sources, making the spatial turn and the turn to material culture, we should be there to teach them about architectural knowledge. Never before has there been such a broad potential audience for evidence of the built environment. We might paraphrase Smale. We need not work under the assumption that history is designed to explain the present, but rather simply to help us understand architecture and the built environment. Thank you.